Michael Bopp. In particular, he is interested in the role of values in the development process and the problem of value transformation as it relates to educational projects. He already holds a master's degree from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. So, without further words, I would like to give as much time as Michael as possible for his presentation, which is View of Man in Development Thinking.
Thanks. I'm holding on to a master's degree at the University of Alberta by my fingernails because I've just completed my thesis and I have to defend it when I go home. They say if you want a Baha'i meeting to start on time, one of the best ways to do it is to get an alarm clock, one of those electric ones, and set it to the time you want the meeting to start. And then when everybody gets there, you plug it in. I was a pioneer in Central Africa, and one of the most interesting challenges that I received in the work that I was doing there was a letter from a government official which asked me to justify the presence of the Baha'i faith in that country in terms of what were we doing for the development of the people. I had to think about that for a minute because I had just assumed that presenting the religion of God to the people was doing something for the development of the people. And eventually I wrote him a letter in which I tried to explain the kinds of contributions that I thought the Baha'i faith was making to the development of the country. And I won't go into the details of that, but it's this kind of a challenge that we are facing as Baha'is all over the world in the pioneering field of making visible, tangible contributions to education, to healthcare, to the development of women, to the unity of communities, to starting of small businesses, to the business of developing nations. And truly, the revelation of Baha'u'llah does address nations and the progress of nations. And so, as a student of development studies, I began to wonder, how could I bring into the context of development studies in universities and in the field working on development projects, how could I bring this revelation of God together with the practical work that's going on? Now, I presented a pretty formidable challenge because I was fairly dismayed after my first year of graduate work in development studies to find that people didn't want to talk about spiritual things at all. It really wasn't what development was all about. Development is all about analyzing the political, economic, or social milieu and figuring out either what is obstructing development or what would aid development. And I puzzled for a long time, wanting always to bring in spiritual values and not quite knowing how to do this. And I was always being confronted with this very analytical, often Marxist, very economic, very straightforward analysis of how it was that poor countries got to be poor, how it was that underdeveloped peoples were unable to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. There are many different ideologies that lie behind these kinds of explanations. And I wanted to read to you a paragraph that I think typifies the kind of attitudes you find on university campuses and in development agencies about bringing spiritual ideas that tell us what is man, why is man, what is man's purpose on this earth, what is the good life, what is the good society. These are questions we have to answer if we're going to talk about development, because developing a society implies the notion that you're going to improve that society in some way. And if you're going to improve that society, you have to know what improvement would be. You have to be able to say, well, what I have here isn't really what I want. I want to go here. And you have to some way of deciding why you should go here and not here or here or here. This is from a book called 2 Cheers for Capitalism. Modern, liberal, secular society is based on the revolutionary premise that there is no superior authoritative information available about the good life or the true nature of human happiness. That this information is implicit only in individual preferences, and that therefore the individual has to be free to develop and express these preferences. What we are witnessing in Western society today are the beginnings of a counter-revolution against this concept of man and society. It is a shame-faced counter-revolution, full of bad faith and paltry sophistry, because it feels compelled to define itself as some kind of a progressive extension of modernity, instead of what so clearly it is, a reactionary revulsion against modernity. This is what you run up against, is people who speak a very flowing language about what man is and what development ought to be, and their rhetoric basically follows this mindset that there really are no absolutes. So we don't know what man is, and we don't know what progress ought to be. I just store that for a minute, and I'd like to now go into my paper. All of us are familiar with statistics that say that industrial society makes up some 20% of the world's population, and that we're using up 80% of the non-renewable resources in the world, or that we have plenty and 85% of the people are suffering and ridden in disease, and that somehow they are the way they are because we are the way we are. This is implied oftentimes in the literature that we read. In our own countries, in the Western industrial countries, there's a growing dissatisfaction with our governments, with our policies overseas, even with the way life is in our cities. And yet, it wasn't always that way. We had 20, 30 years ago, there was a high spirit of optimism, especially after the wars, the Second World War and stuff, where especially the United States was sending out vast quantities of energy in the forms of money, in the forms of technical aid. There were programs like the Truman Point 4 program, which rebuilt Europe and then was taken to South America, other places. And the whole idea of these programs is that what we have in North America or in a Western industrial society in general, what we have is where everybody is going. Now behind this was a theory which in universities and in sort of development circles came to be known as modernization theory. It's a theory that nobody pays any lip service to anymore, but I think most people still believe in it one way or another. The basic idea of this theory is that you can take all societies on earth, from the most primitive to the most developed or modern, and you put them on a linear line, on a linear scale. The traditional on one end and the modern on the other, and we're the modern. And everybody is moving gradually, step by step, forward in more or less the same progressive pattern towards modernity. Now the object of development, as seen within the context of modernization theory, is to make everybody modern. Development studies as a discipline emerged in looking at this phenomenon all over the world, in looking at industrialized nations' efforts in the third world and the poor nations' efforts to develop themselves. And lots of disciplines got involved in it: sociology, political science, economics, philosophy. Now religious studies is getting involved in it. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of details about the internal arguments in the field of development studies, except to say that right now, the current sort of problem that's being worked on over again, it's really a kind of a renewal of the current of a problem that they started off with, is asking the question, well, what really is development? What do we mean when we say development? How can we tell when a society is developing? Most of what we have now in terms of, in the field of development studies in the literature, is a critique of what has been done. Is a critique that basically analyzes structurally, that is politically and economically, the relationships between the rich countries and the poor countries, between the developing agencies and the recipient benefactors of this enterprise. And this analysis tries to determine why or why not these kinds of efforts are helping or hindering the development process of the country. Now, what I wanted to look at was what actually in the last we've had about 30 years of this kind of intensive effort in the third world trying to help poor countries develop. And the United Nations has conveniently divided these 30 years into what they've called development decades. And after 30 years, much the same kinds of patterns that we started off with, only a worsening, in fact, of some of the conditions that brought on these patterns, is seen. And so I looked in this paper at not the rhetoric that the United Nations Bulletin or the World Bank report or CETA or these other organizations that are doing development, not the rhetoric that they published, but at the kinds of projects they were doing. I had a chance to see them in Africa, and I've had a chance to review them in my work. And I tried to say, well, okay, they're building a university in Rwanda. They're sending staff to staff this university. What sorts of assumptions about man can we draw out of this kind of a project? When in fact Rwanda is a country where 95% of the people are illiterate, where the people who go to this university end up in the capital in cushy jobs with driving Mercedes and big houses, and it doesn't really relate to the development of these people. It isn't helping them very much at all. In fact, it's creating a barrier between the rich and the poor. It's actually widening the gap and making it more difficult for the majority of the people in the country to develop. So I wanted to ask two questions. What's the nature of man? It's a very old question, and it's not a question anymore that's very popular in academic circles. And the second one was, given different definitions of the nature of man, what sort of development policies or practices would come out of that definition? Now, development doesn't mean the same thing when used by different people, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. In the north, in Canada's north, there has been a considerable controversy in the Mackenzie Valley about a pipeline. And the Dene Nation, that's an Indian organization there, the Dene people, have been forced to go to court and go to hearings quite a number of times to defend their position that they don't want a pipeline because they see it as anti-developmental. That they, the Dene people, can't develop as long as southern Canada imposes this kind of massive industrial project on them. They were asked in a court case to defend this position, and the lawyer for the government said, well, are the Dene against development? And their answer was, the issue isn't whether or not the Dene are against development. There's not a human being anywhere that is against the betterment of human society unless that person has lost most of his faculties. But you notice that the term here changes its meaning, that is development, changes its meaning depending on who is using it. When Exxon Corporation, that's the major company that controls all these little companies that want to do the work up there, when that company speaks of development in Canada's north, what they really mean is the establishment of an elaborate constellation of mechanisms, all coordinated for the singular purpose of extracting mineral resources. When the Dene Nation speaks of development, they're talking about the development of their people, of their society. So we have these terms like modernization or progress or betterment, and we're not really sure now what would constitute progress or who gets to decide what direction development should take a society. Do you get to decide because you're more powerful? Do you get to decide because you're standing on the ground, you live there and you have control of that territory? Do you get to decide because you're right, because you have some sort of an ideology that says that you're right? Because you can make a revolution and overthrow the government in power? How do you get to decide? There's an organization called the Club of Rome. Some of you know about it. It's sort of like the Royal Society of old, a group of intellectuals who have gotten together, and their major task is to study the world problem, what they call the world problématique. And what they mean by this is that humanity is slowly but surely destroying itself in every sphere, political, economic, pollution, all sorts of problems that we're creating for ourselves. And they want to study these problems and see what we could do to get out of this mess before it's too late. The president of the Club of Rome wrote these words about progress. Conceived as the acme of human enterprise, progress has the mission of procuring ever more information, and knowledge and ever more goods and equipment for the earth's growing billions, so that they may have material wealth and power with which to tame nature and to better their existence. Every human group has interpreted this as a mandate to seek as much of this progress as it can for its own good, not disdaining to outdo other groups in the process. Now, there's been a consequence to this. And he goes on. It eventually began to dawn on us that by the indiscriminate adoption of this pattern, we were all too often paying exorbitant social or ecological costs for improvements obtained, and were even induced to neglect the virtues and values which are the foundations of a healthy society, and at the same time the very salt for the quality of life. Then came the creeping doubt that for all its greatness, humanity lacked wisdom. Well, if the Club of Rome assessment is correct, then mankind is on the brink of a self-inflicted annihilation. We're kind of rushing towards this annihilation like lemmings, mindlessly, kind of happily. And what I've done, because when I look at what we're doing in the world, when I look at the results of Western industrial civilization, I'm dismayed at the notion that we're exporting this to the other two-thirds of humanity. And we're advocating that they produce a replication of our society, when in fact our society is in so much trouble that we need to look elsewhere for models. We need to search both inwardly and outwardly for a way of getting ourselves out of this mess that we're creating for ourselves. We've confused having, the possession of material goods, with being. So I wanted to look very carefully at some of the ideas that lie behind the things that we do all over the world. And we do freely what we want to do because we're big and we're powerful. What I did was I juxtaposed two sets of ideas about man. One I called the modern view of man, although it isn't really very modern. And the other is what I'm calling the religious view of man. The modern view of man, what I've done really is I've taken 7 basic assumptions that I have drawn out of the activities of Western industrial nations, mostly in the third world. And I've said, well, they've done this and this and this, and out of these things you can assume that they believe that man is a machine, but they believe that man has the right to dominate other men, because really that's the purpose of life. They must believe that because that's how they're behaving. So I've taken 7 such assumptions, and I've tried to say, well, what kind of development do we get out of these assumptions? Then I've drawn out of the world's religions what I think are assumptions that all of the religions seem to agree upon. Some of them, just some of them, as an example, to make a comparison. And I also drew 7 of them. And then I say, well, what kind of development will we get if we take these assumptions and try to apply them into practice in the development field? Now, for people who don't believe in God, looking at the religion seems like a waste of time, frankly. And also, the notion that the religions could agree on anything seems pretty strange to a lot of people. They look at religions and all they see is diversity. And so I have a section of my paper which deals, though not very deeply, with the question of the unity of religions, because at the heart of religions, I'm arguing, burns a fire that is really the same fire. But this is something that has to be discovered inwardly. And I didn't want to argue the point in the paper, but merely say that here are the religions, another source of information. They claim to be another source of information about man. Since science and politics and some of these other things that we've been drawing on as a source of information about man has not produced such a wonderful world, let's take a look at this other option. What I have not done in this paper is made a Baha'i outline of what Baha'i development is. I don't think we're ready to do that yet. We're right in the doorway of that. 20 years ago, people entered the field of education. Baha'is entered the field of education. And they began trying to say, what would Baha'i education be? And 20 years down the road, they still haven't answered that question, but they're a little bit closer because they have Baha'i schools and a lot of Baha'i projects and a lot of really fine Baha'i thinkers looking at the problem and trying to bring the writings into the field of education. Well, right now, we're on the doorstep of doing this with international development, with societal development. What would the Baha'i ideals, what would the vision that Baha'u'llah has given us for a new world order, How would that translate practically, day to day, in helping poor societies, or even our own society, to develop? Okay, I'm just going to name these 7 principles, and then I'll talk a little bit about them. The first 7 are what I'm calling the modern view of man. I'll say again that they're not the sort of thing that you find in the urbane humanism of the university circles. People don't talk like this. They would never espouse these kind of things. But the practices of agencies like CETA, like the World Bank, like the United Nations, or the practices of third world governments, when you look at what they're actually doing, or the practice of our own government in the North, you can draw out of those practices, I think, these assumptions. The first one is man is an animal, and therefore economic development equals human development. If he has more food, if he has better shelter, if he has better health care, that's development. Another one is the essence of life is struggle for dominance. Another one is man is a clever machine. I've been treated like a clever machine since I got to the university. Man and the universe are finite, knowable, and controllable through science. That everything about man that is to be known can be known through science, and even predicted and controlled, if we're to believe Skinner. Another one was that there was no such thing as human nature, per se, that man makes himself. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. There is no human nature, he says, because there's no God to make a human being. So man just is what he wants to be. Another one is noblesse oblige, which usually means that if you're noble and of higher station, then you have an obligation to take care of the people who are below you. But I just use this as a catchphrase because in this context it means the most modern are obviously the most developed and are therefore the best qualified to guide the development of others. And then finally, man is an amoral being. Morality doesn't have anything to do with it. There's neither goodness nor badness in it. Any means that is necessary is justifiable to ensure development. And the development process is above the whole question of morality, or it's supramoral. So I'll just go over those briefly. Essence of life is struggle for dominance. I'll go over those briefly and talk a little bit about each one of them. I'm going to hurry, or I'll never get to the second part. Man is an animal. That was the first one. He's a complex animal, that's for sure. But in the final analysis, he's an animal. Therefore, his animal needs, such as his need for food and shelter and good health, must be the intended fruit of any development process. Higher order needs, this is coming from Maslow, higher order needs will automatically be met. That's like if you have a spiritual need or a need for love or something like that, you'll get that when you get enough food. It just sort of comes with it. Hence, it's clear that we must equate economic development, which is increasing man's capacity to win a living from his environment. We should equate that with human development because it all comes in one package. Okay. So a lot of our development efforts in the third world are aimed at improving the economy of developing countries. Now, this is very convenient because it turns out that by improving the economy of Brazil, the United States corporations that are involved in that process are making millions of dollars. In fact, there's more money going out of Brazil than there is going in. Proposition 2, the essence of life is struggle for dominance. Well, it follows that our own survival, Canada, United States, France, whatever, our own survival justifies any manipulation of the forces in the underdeveloped society to make sure that our own interests are served, no matter what the cost is to those people. So when we combine these first two ideas, that is, that man is an animal, and so economic development is what development is really all about. And this other one, that we have the right to dominate others because it's a dog-eat-dog world, and if we can be on top, well, that's how it is. That's how we function. When we combine these two, what we get is that it makes eminent good sense to develop the economy of the other country because it helps us, and incidentally, there's a trickle-down of the benefits to help the poor people in those countries. In fact, there was a theory which a guy won, actually he shared a Nobel Prize for. He's a very famous economist named Arthur Lewis, and it's called the trickle-down theory. Third proposition, man is a clever machine. That means, when we translate this into development goals, it means that his operational needs have to be met in order for him to function at an optimum level. If people aren't eating right, then they can't think right. And if they can't think right, they can't work right. If they can't work right, they can't produce right. And if they can't produce right, we don't make any money. Ultimately, development means the improvement of the standard of living of these people, probably in an urban context, because that would mean that they would begin to have what we have, and obviously what we have, everyone is comfortable, everyone has a good living unit, everyone has a good health maintenance system, everybody has a job, and that's what life is all about. Proposition 4. Man and the universe are finite, knowable, and controllable through the rigorous application of the scientific method. This is an important one. This is one that is continually being thrown at me as a student in the university, that science has all the answers, that there's nothing beyond science, really. And that any problems that may have arisen in the wake of this modernization process that the world is now going through, problems like biospheric nuclear poisoning or international terrorism, those kind of problems can be solved by science. Proposition 5, that there is no such thing as human nature, that man makes himself, that human beings are capable of adapting to a complete restructuring of their own culture, of their own lifestyles, of their own family structures, that man is malleable. He's a piece of clay, can become anything he wants or anything anybody else wants. He's likely to change. He will change because he's rational. It makes much more sense to want to improve yourself. Now, whose definition of improvement? We have to deal with that. Education will certainly assist in this process of getting people to adopt modern values and to involve themselves in the process of transforming their own society. Proposition 6, noblesse oblige. The most modern are obviously the most developed and are thereby best qualified to guide the development of others, less developed than themselves. Now, traditional people tend to get locked into a mode of thinking that misconstrues the objectives of development, and they tend to view their own conventional wisdoms as somehow superior to the discoveries of science. Of course, that's foolish. So it's very unlikely that a developing people can adequately direct the course of their own development. So we have to come in there and help them to direct the course of their own development, because they're just not able to do that. Proposition 7. Man is an amoral being, and so development is a supramoral process above morality. Now, I don't want to talk too much about that because I'm going to get into that in a little while, but basically the idea of that is that when people oppose in a developing society, they oppose the efforts that, say, the United Nations is making, or the Canadian government is making, or some other government is making in helping them to develop. They're deviant. There's something wrong with them. Because anybody in his right mind would want development. And they simply have some wrong values, and we have to change their values. Now, nobody who presents himself as a professional today, or very few people anyway, would use those kind of terms, would talk in that kind of way. It's a gross over-exaggeration of the kind of ideals or values, really values and assumptions that lie underneath the actions that people take. Even though they have one kind of rhetoric, they mouth certain kinds of ideals, they behave in certain other kinds of ways. And it may not be individuals' fault. It may be that 45 years ago we structured our economy and our relationships with these countries in such ways that there really, institutionally, aren't very many other ways that we know how to deal with these countries. The fact of the matter is, though, that when we look at the outcomes of the process that we've engaged in the Third World in the last 30 years, that is the last 3 development decades, the sad fact is that there's a greater gap between the rich and the poor. There are more poor than there were now because the population has increased, but also there's a greater gap between the rich and the poor. There's more hunger, there's more disease, there's more social instability, there's more squalor, there's more unnecessary deaths, there's more feelings of hopelessness, impotence, there's less dignity for the average individual. Something's wrong. We've been trying to help these people, and they're not being helped. Maybe it's their fault. It's blaming the poor idea. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Still, when we as individuals are confronted with a phenomenon of underdevelopment and we stare at it, We're nauseated by it. It smells. It's ugly. It repulses us. I want to read a quotation by a very prominent scholar in the field of development studies who is just now saying we have to bring religion, values, into the field of development. He says, underdevelopment is shocking. The squalor, the disease, the unnecessary deaths, the hopelessness of it all. No man understands if underdevelopment remains for him a mere statistic reflecting low income, poor housing, premature mortality, or underemployment. The prevalent emotion of underdevelopment is a sense of personal and societal impotence in the face of disease and death, of confusion and ignorance as one gropes to understand change, of servility towards men whose decisions govern the course of events, of hopelessness before hunger and natural catastrophe. Now, when we look at this, we really have to ask the question, as Baha'is now entering in the field of international development with projects like Radio Baha'i Ecuador, we have to ask, well, how can authentic development occur out of this pitiable state of affairs? We just cannot replicate what all of the developing agencies in the world have been doing. We have to start again with the principles for building a new world order that Baha'u'llah has given us. And with those principles, we have to undertake a revolutionary new approach to the field of development. Now, they're going to tell us that science has all the answers. There's a biologist named Dobzhansky, if I'm saying that correctly, I hope, Dobzhansky, I never can say his name right, who wrote the following: evolution need no longer be a destiny imposed from without. It may conceivably be controlled by man, evolution, in accordance with his wisdom and his values. Well, which wisdom? Which values? Science can't give us those values. And even if Thomas Kuhn, who is a sort of a philosopher in the history of science, he writes that the values of the current society sneak into science, and scientists actually in the laboratories aren't so pure and value-free. That a lot of the decisions that they make and the kinds of hypotheses that they lay are actually imported into the laboratory surreptitiously. Well, another biologist writes, no longer is man the offspring of nature, the creature of natural selection. Science has provided him with the technology to become his own maker. His own maker. Another one says, we foresee a time within the next decade when genetic surgeons will be able to delete undesirable genes, insert others, and mechanically or chemically transform still others, foreordaining at the molecular level the physical, mental, even racial characteristics of the incipient individual. Another one says that man will have the opportunity to literally remake himself in whatever image he chooses. Isn't that marvelous? What image will he choose? That's what we have to ask ourselves. So that leads me to go to the religious view of man. I'm skipping a section in which I tried to demonstrate very, very briefly the unity of religions. And I'm now going on to a series of propositions that I have drawn out of the world's religions. That man is a created creature. That man is a spiritual being. That man is created in the image of God. That human nature is not fixed and static. Rather, it is vital, becoming, unfolding, developmental. That human progress is dependent on the exercise of human will, combined with some external assistance from some agent, whether it's a divine agent or a human agent. That's a very interesting one. I want to deal with that one afterwards. That man's true destiny and his social purpose in the world is to carry forth an ever-advancing civilization. And finally, that mankind is one family. Now let's look at these. The first one is that man was a created creature. Well, that means if he's a created creature, he was created intentionally. And if that's true, then that must signal the existence of some ultimate purposes and reasons outside a purely mechanistic response to random environmental stimulus for man's presence in the world. There's a story that I told in here about a farmer who had to go on a trip, and he had a tomato farm. And he got a worker to take care of his tomato plants when he was gone. And this worker had never seen tomato plants. He didn't know very much about them. And so when these little yellow things started appearing on the tomato plants, he thought they were a blight and he cut them off. And every time they appeared, he thought, well, I got to keep these tomato plants healthy, so he cut them off. And he had the bushiest, greenest tomato plants you've ever seen, but when the farmer came back, there weren't any tomatoes. Of course, because that's the flower. Now, this may be what we're doing to ourselves as human beings in the kind of societal structures we create for ourselves, in the kind of education programs we make for our children, if we don't have any idea about God's purpose for man. A whimsical selection of strategies and goals for societal development is just not enough, because we may be nipping off our buds. The second one, man is a spiritual being. In development literature today, the most popular jargon is talking about basic human needs, and it's abbreviated BHN. They abbreviate everything. Right? And the World Bank has just published a report about human resources development, HRD. And basic human needs and human resources development propose a new approach to development in which we're centering on man and we're going to develop human capacities. Which capacities? We don't have an adequate theory of needs because we don't know what man is. If man is just a machine, or if he's just a material being, then as Brzezinski, the past security advisor in the United States, said, culture in our country is when we got 5% more of material goods per annum. If what the religions are telling us about man's nature is true, then human needs for transcendence and meaning may be even more basic than those for food or security. And we have examples, such as Gandhi's independence movement, where people were willing to sacrifice food or even life itself for an ideal. And it's out of this sort of stuff that authentic revolutions are made. And such has also been the fire and the solace of religious martyrs, from the Roman Forum to the firing squads of Shiraz, Yazd, and Tabriz. Christ said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, which is within you, and then that everything else will be added unto you." Well, modern development strategies are precisely the reversal of this injunction. They say, seek ye first the material development of your society, and then everything else will be added onto you. Next one, man is created in the image of God. Well, if that's the case, then the purpose of man's existence, which is to know and worship God, his capacities must lie far beyond his material existence. What we can see when we look at present mankind is not all that man can be, because God is infinite. If man is a reflection of God, then he also has infinite capacities. If we look at most of the most advanced thinkers, people even like Erich Fromm, who is a Marxist and a Freudian and a humanist and an atheist and an existentialist. He's a very strange dude. I deal with that in here, by the way, but I don't want to talk about it now because it just muddle things up. He says, if you want to know what man is, you have to look at what man has done and what man has been. What man has done and what he has been is studied in the fields of psychology, anthropology, sociology, history. And by looking at what man has done and what man has been, you know what man is. Marshall McLuhan, he's the guy that writes things like The Medium is the Message. He said, he calls this rear view mirrorism. He says it's like driving a car, having a crazy chauffeur that's driving a car 100 miles an hour down a twisting mountain road, looking only in the rear view mirror. This is what humanity is doing, by not looking into the future of our possibilities. And the only place we're going to know about the future of our possibilities, say the religions, is by looking to some divine source which can mirror back these capacities, because we're created in the image and likeness of God. Now there's another aspect to this, and that's morality. Traditional societies had good values, and those values held the societies together. But when we come in with values that say it's all right to pursue your own self-interest as an individual, but if you're a public servant, you cannot promote your own self-interest. And then you get third world leaders who have become their elite in that country because they were aggressive and they pursued their own self-interest, and all of a sudden they have the country in their hands. What's going to stop them from pursuing their own self-interest? Nothing. They don't have the values internalized that they had from their traditional society, and they're not getting it from anywhere else. And this is the problem over and over again that we encounter in the developing world. Where are the solid values going to come from? How are we going to have honesty? You can't have cooperative in a poor... In Rwanda, one of the biggest problems was that nobody trusted each other. Because they used to have a school for lying. This is the truth. They had a school for lying, and they sent their smartest kids to that school because it was socially useful to have a politically adept liar in the family. And one family was played off against another family, and that was the old political system. Well, when these people get in a co-op, it's a mess because they don't trust each other. How do you deal with that question of honesty and values on a basic level? Proposition 4, that human nature is not fixed and static, that it's a becoming and an unfolding thing. No. One biologist wrote this very interesting thing. He says, the aggregate volume of all the genes in the sex cells which produce the contemporary world population of 4 billion people probably does not exceed the volume of a vitamin capsule. How precarious that this tiny mass contains all the biological heredity of the living representations of our species. The religions go on and they say, no, there's much, much more to man lying latent within him than what we look at. Baha'u'llah says, consider the tree, how the fruit, ere it is formed, lieth potentially within that tree. Were the tree to be cut into pieces, no sign nor any part of the fruit, however small, can be detected. With children in children's classes, I sometimes have them cut apart seeds to see if they can find a tree in there. Jean Piaget, who writes in the area of child development and intelligence and cognitive development, is, to my mind anyway, one of the leading thinkers in the area of cognitive development. And he's saying we don't really know exactly how human intelligence comes out of the biological context of man. We don't know. It does. And continually there are more and more and more human capacities that just pop out. We don't know. The Club of Rome said that we need a kind of approach to development in the third world. That is, and they were speaking in this case in the area of education. We need a kind of development that anticipates man's needs, anticipates man's capacities, looks into the future. They say anticipation is not limited simply to encouraging desirable trends. It means inventing new ones. Okay, I'm going now to my conclusions. I'm just going to summarize some of them. We need a research component in our approach to development that tries to anticipate, our science should try to anticipate knowledge about man that's going to be needed in the future. A researcher will have to look for truth that is inescapable, not simply a kind of reductionist approach to man and about man's capacities that are based on where he's been, but also on what he might be, what he could be in the future. We have to be able to do that. We need to involve in the development process the participation of the individuals, that is the community and the society, the people there who are going through the process of development. They have to be doing it. It cannot be done for them. The change process has to be rooted in indigenous cultural values. Local culture, local religion, local customs have to be the springboard, the starting place, because development is a process from one point out of it to another point. And that development policies and practices have to be guided by sound moral principles. This would require a concerted effort to reinforce the crumbling moral structures in a developing society. Values like honesty and trustworthiness and justice and equality. We need an approach towards education that is a lifelong education approach. So that from cradle to grave, people are learning about who they could be and who they are. And most of all, they're learning how to contribute to the process of the development of their society. Allah says, I created thee rich. Why dost thou bring thyself down to poverty? Noble I made thee. Wherewith dost thou abase thyself? Out of the essence of knowledge I gave thee being. Why seekest thou enlightenment from anyone beside me? Out of the clay of love I molded thee. How dost thou busy thyself with another? Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting.